We met, I guess, last summer it was, and started exploring the idea of, as I learned more about Isabel's career and sort of the remarkable things she's written, the remarkable things she's had a hand in editing, and then got to know her and learn more about her approach and sort of thinking about connecting, especially popular cultural and events and the strong community advocacy work that she does as well. It just became obvious that she needed to be on campus and working with our students. And so we're really excited that she is a Kerr Visiting Scholar in the Arts for the year. This is a position that comes around every once in a while when things align and we're able to get really remarkable people in to work with our students. It's happened 3 times. The first one was Bobby Rush, who's a iconic blues singer. The second is Preston Lauterbach, who's an author, wrote Beale Street Dynasty, wrote books about the Chitlin Circuit. And each one of these has been a little bit different. And so the scope of her work, which I think we may talk about a little bit at the end, and we can answer questions. So she's been on campus already. She's been working with the Kerr Fellows, finding our way, specifically helping us in thinking about narratives in everything that we do, in all of our work, and thinking about the narratives, thinking about the stories that are behind this. She's visited the music community in Memphis class, which is the Kerr Institute class, twice. Once was to just sort of, tell about how she got here, and the second she did an interviewing workshop, which was really wonderful. She's been mentoring student projects. Specifically, she's been working with Sarah Link and Emily Burkhead. They're doing a documentary about the Audubon house, Elvis's house coming back to life. In the spring, as the house is rebuilt, she's going to help us think about the narrative of reincorporating that house into what's become the Kerr Institute, without that house, so reintegrating into and thinking about that. In March, sort of as one of the culminating events, Isabel has written and helped edit a book about a collection of essays about Beyonce, Queen Bey. I've forgotten more about after the colon, celebration of life and creativity.
Of power and creativity
of Beyonce. And so, as part of that event, we're going to host a discussion on campus with Veronica Chambers, the editor of the book. She's going to be here at sort of the Memphis book release. It's going to be released in March, and some other contributors. So that's going to be really exciting to think about Beyonce and specifically issues of culture and southernness and sort of identity. Those are going to be some of the major themes of that talk. So that's going to be in March. But today, I wanted to make sure that people who were interested had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about your career up to this point. And then we can talk a little bit about the time with students too. So the first thing that piqued as we were interested is that Isabel was one of the editors and wrote for Billboard magazine. So obviously with the Kerr Institute, that was the natural connection. But learning more about the writing that she did for them and sort of the themes that emerged there, and going back, she's also been an editor for InStyle magazine, for Teen People, and I'm going to bring up a story about that in just a second. But it's written for Harper's Bazaar, is constantly called upon as a journalist and as an editor to talk to sort of the cultural movers and shakers in terms of popular culture, but bring, the remarkable thing from her writing is how she connects these things that we read about in pop culture, the things that move the needle, the things that are getting hits, the things that are getting likes, and connects these to what we're seeing in the news and in these events that are often pretty jarring and like we're trying to work through, but these two worlds that are interfaced all the time, how to sort of think about connecting these two and how they reflect on each other. So
You make my work sound so much more
No,
academic than
no,
it
no,
is.
no,
It's
it's-
really just celebrity profiles, but
It's
I guess it sort of is that
no,
too.
no,
So
but no,
thank
but
you.
it, no, it, but it, and then to hear it with our students, it's been remarkable. So yeah, so I'll leave that there, and because for first, welcome.
Thank you.
Rhodes,
I'm
it's really
so
exciting
honored to be
have you
here.
here. I guess just start off. You did this in the class, but would you just sort of talk about how you got to the steps that you took and how you got to do the sort of work that you did
Sure.
initially?
Sure, thank you. Well, I never set out to be a journalist. I never set out sort of to be a pop culture aficionado, although I always was very interested in magazines and pop culture. I think I've mentioned before that my father is an academic, and so I was on a strict course to be a marine biologist, mainly because I liked dolphins, until I failed chemistry at Tulane, which is where I went to school. And then I was a mass comm major. That was sort of the most generalist major that they offered, that sort of tapped into some of my interests culturally. I feel like I meet all of your amazing students, and I don't know if it's whatever you all are doing here at Rhodes so effectively, but everybody seems to have a clear vision of their future, and I didn't. I can say when I graduated with pretty much with certainty that I did not know what I wanted to do. So I moved to Europe for a year. I had an opportunity to live there, and that was a great opportunity for me to further sort of reflect on what it is that I wanted to do. And when I came back, I started working for what was then sort of the initial programming for Cartoon Network. So jumped straight into pop culture. To my parents' sort of dismay, because I had deferred going to UVA, Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy, but it all sort of comes back around, which is interesting in life. So I worked on a show called Space Goes Coast to Coast, which was a very obscure, but God bless you for knowing. You're right. Late night talk show. It's weird to say that because it was literally a superhero cartoon, animated, interviewing people, well, like Metallica. It was absurdist humor, and it was great, and it was all pop culture content and telling the most irreverent sort of narratives in a really cool medium. But I quickly realized that I did not enjoy sitting in edit suites for 8 hours a day. I liked the idea of producing things and executing and pulling projects together, but I'm not such a fan of animation that I could bear to sit in a dark editing suite for 8 hours a day. So anyway, not knowing really what I wanted to do, the Olympics were coming to Atlanta, and that was a pivotal time, obviously, in Atlanta's history, advancing it from culturally, let's say. And I was, no joke, at a bar having a conversation with a friend. I had long admired alternative weeklies for their voice and their point of view. And there was one in Atlanta called Creative Loafing that was sort of the alt weekly of record, and it was like the Village Voice, for those of you who know what the Village Voice is. Rest in peace. Anywho, and I said out loud to my friend, Atlanta's changing so much, but nobody's covering the nightlife, nobody's covering the subversive set, the movers and shakers, that are sort of creating this new environment here in Atlanta. And the editor-in-chief of the newspaper was sitting next to me and said, "You want a column? I'll give it to you. You got to write for free." And I was like, done, taking it. And that's one of the things I always tell young people, that when opportunities present themselves, I know money is important, and I lived at home with my parents, and so I had the luxury to be able to do something for free. For a little while at least, but I took that opportunity because I knew it would allow me to sort of scratch that itch and be like, okay, well, maybe this is a path I need to follow. And so I did, and that column took off. And it was, inspired by Michael Musto, who's sort of a preeminent a nightlife chronicler in New York City, and I did my best, and I'm sure it's terrible, and I will not go back and reread any of those columns, and thank God they haven't been digitized. So that got me on my journalism track. I mean, I really wasn't a journalist, but I had a good editor, and he taught through a nightlife column, taught me how to write and report and tell stories in an interesting way. Eventually, I started getting paid a little bit, and I was able to quit my job at Cartoon Network. Actually, I think I was laid off, by the way. So don't get, sometimes things happen, and don't lose your footing when you lose your first job. And I was part of a downsizing. It was not because of something I did. But I remember that was my first experience in corporate America and being downsized. Anywho, I had this sort of backup plan that I was building, and I became the editor of a local weekly magazine, which was like the ultimate education in how to run a magazine with very little money and absolutely not knowing what I was doing. So, but given sort of autonomy to create something and to apply a vision at a time in Atlanta, not unlike Memphis now, that there was a lot of energy and a lot of really exciting things happening. And about 2 years into that, I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. I like curating. I like assigning pieces. I love interacting with writers. I love finding stories. I love surfacing stories that I believe in, that that the world, in this case Atlanta, needed to know about. And once I had identified that as a passion, I knew I needed to sort of graduate from Atlanta and go to New York, because New York is where you are and need to be in media. And another thing I always tell students, it took me 2 years to get a job in New York. This was pre-ish internet, so it was a lot of looking at names on mastheads, the diligence and dedication of sending resumes ritualistically, on my own dime, going up to New York. I was still living at home with my parents and just pounding the pavement, and it, no joke, took me 2 years to get a job. And I never felt defeated in that journey. I trusted in that journey. I think that's part of youth, is that you sort of can endear yourself to the energy and the emotional excitement of what the future holds. And for some reason, sure, I would get rejection letters and get deflated, but there was a constitutional tenacity that's probably rooted in my immigrant background, that I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to get a job at Condé Nast Traveler. Let me try Vogue, whatever. Until finally I got a call from Time Inc. And they hired me. They called me up, and I met with folks, and I went to a magazine called Teen People, which is essentially was the junior version of People magazine. And it was at a time, for those of you who sort of remember that era, where Teen Vogue was emerging, Elle Girl. There were only two big contenders in that realm, and that was 17 and YM. And then there was like an explosion that was concurrent with the boy band explosion and with Britney Spears. So Teen People was one of those. Our point of differentiation from the pack was that we were unisex, essentially, and we were more rooted in real teen stories as opposed to the glorification of celebrity. And we were body positive we were all about just encouraging youth voices in a way that had not been encouraged, and at a time when photoshopping was still sort of de rigueur. So that was a great experience. So I was there for 7 years, and I also tell people, if they're thinking about moving to New York or LA, one of the best decisions I ever made was moving back home. And this is, obviously it's a personal sort of journey, but for me, it was moving back home. I could have gone to New York straight after college and waited tables there and sort of found my path there. But what waiting allowed me to do was to move later in my 20s and not have to have a side hustle in New York. So I was able to move to New York at a higher level without the burden of worrying about finances. So sometimes, I know people are very hungry. I don't know if people are still hungry to move to New York and LA, but if you are hungry to move to New York and LA, it doesn't have to be immediately. That dream can be there 3 years from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now. And sometimes it's better to wait because you become a bigger fish in a smaller pond, and then you go there and you're making more money and you have more respect. And it's just a different way of entering a marketplace that for me at least worked. So anyway, so I was at Teen People where I launched a program called the Trend Spotters, which was a proto-social media environment, I guess, where they very smartly, with the emergence of the internet, started to realize that they could harness the power of their community of subscribers to help influence the content that appeared in the magazine. So I was there to sort of help innovate and propel that. And I think when, it started with like literally 200 interested young people from around the nation to 15,000 when I left, and which was mostly done through like listservs, but also kind of cultivating these communities across the United States, and we had a dedicated section to them in the magazine. And then you had essentially the benefit of in-house counsel and in-house focus groups. So it was also there that I really became the generalist that I am. A lot of times when people go into media, they know, okay, I want to be a features editor and I just want to cover, human interest, or I want to be a beauty editor and I'm just going to cover beauty, or I'm fashion. And those are sort of your tracks. And really, when you're in those tracks, you stay on those tracks. And those tracks are both critical to your vertical ascent in those arenas, but can also be limiting because you can't cross over. So once a beauty editor, generally always a beauty editor. Once a fashion editor, generally always a fashion editor. And I had a really hard time, as I still do, being defined by one role. So I sort of managed, just through my own raising my hand, to be the person that could sometimes go in and do a home story, or sometimes go in and do a prom, in this case a prom story, or, as it turned out, 9/11.
Yeah, please talk a little bit about that. So I've heard this story before, but I really appreciate if you shared it. And the idea of working for this teen-focused magazine in New York at that moment.
Right. So we moved to New York in 2000. I moved to New York in 2000, and 9/11 happened a year later. Right? Yes. I had, up until that point, I had pretty much known that pop culture was my jam. I had done an internship briefly in college at CNN and was like, oh gosh, this is I could not speak the language. I was really out of place in terms of international politics, geography. So I was never, when I was at Teen People, I had already, and even in Atlanta, really slanted toward lifestyle and culture. But 9/11 happened, and there were only a few of us in the city, because a lot of people live in Brooklyn or Queens or, in sort of the outer boroughs. And it was one of those opportunities to just raise your hand and say, I'll come into the office. I can walk there. We lived on the Upper West Side. The office was in the Time Life building, which is no longer on 49th and 6th. And we didn't come in that day because nobody really knew what was happening. And there was, I could still remember, you could see we lived on the top floor on 88th and Columbus, and we had a little rooftop terrace, and you could see the smoke all the way downtown, and that's 5 miles, but we had a straight line to that, and you could smell and it was beautiful, and it was really, it was a beautiful day, and it was just we were all in shock. So I think the second day or third day, a small group of us convened in the office, and obviously, I don't remember what the sort of content plans were, who was going to be on the cover, what franchise we were working on, but it was it was my first experience dealing with a story where it's all hands on deck and this becomes your main focus. So I just volunteered and I said, okay, well, let's go down. And I had an editor Tina Johnson, who just sort of had faith in me and said, okay, I want you to go down and find teens or young people who were impacted and tell their stories. And she trusted me to do that, both from the reporting aspect as well as the diplomacy aspect, right? And the empathy aspect, because you're going into an uncertain situation. And it was sort of the first time that I've had to engage people around tragedy. So I went down there. And at this point, I'm still sort of unfamiliar with the city. I don't think I had spent that much time downtown. I'd been to the World Trade Center before and, had drinks like everybody did there at the top. And it was, it was just like what the pictures were, it was decimated, but there was a flurry of activity. And I don't even think I'd done, because the internet service was spotty and cell phone service was spotty. So it was really like man on the street reporting and just sort of visually identifying like, well, that person looks sort of young. Who are they? What are they doing down there? And so I found a doctor, a resident, very young resident who was working triage and, hadn't slept. And I told his story. I found a young woman who had, I think, been studying social works in some university up north and literally just felt called to be there to help provide counseling to the firemen and to the policemen and to the first responders. Told her story. And I found a young Latino who did not speak English who was looking for the bodega where he had been working, and sort of told his story. And I was able to interview him in Spanish. And there may have been some other ones, but so that was my first that was my first real exposure to breaking news, and finding people. And I'm sure there are people, I just can't remember whom I approached and didn't want to talk, but I was able to get some really powerful narratives from these individuals. And actually, it's funny because on the anniversary this past year, there were 3 of us who sort of convened for this effort, and one of them posted the whole package on the website, on Facebook, and we all sort of collectively were like, we should find those kids and see where they are now and follow up with them. So we might do that next year and tell their stories, because it's so fleeting at the moment and it's so sort of ephemeral. So in any case, so that was like really, really powerful. And maybe after that, I started to do a few more human interest things, or at least I trusted that I could do them. And I remember my editor at the time saying, I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you. Like that takes a certain kind of person to do that. Like you have to be brave, And I mean, not that I deserve a medal, but it takes a certain kind of person. And I'm just not shy, so I was able to sort of approach people, strangers, engage them in a way that immediately created an intimacy between us, where they felt comfortable enough to tell their story. So that was sort of like a profound New York journalism experience, number one.
Yeah. So I'm curious. So that with that experience, your career goes on, you work for other publications, you become somebody who interviews, and I'll come back to this, interviews a lot of really famous people, but this sort of social piece of it, like the next thing that I noticed you write is that the issues around gun violence seem to be something that you write a lot about, and how that intersects with with pop culture. So I wonder, if we could just transition just a bit into those stories.
Sure.
Do I need to also keep an eye on time as well?
I'll keep the eye.
Okay.
We're good.
I mean, I think that starting with 9/11, like social justice became something that was important to me. And I started to see, my mother had always been a Hispanic rights and minority rights advocate in the South. But I started to see the intersectionality and power of journalism to help tell stories around social justice and equity. And I think specific to Billboard, where I was the deputy editor, in that second year I was there in 2015 is when Bataclan happened. And so it was not unlike 9/11 in that everything that we had to do, the whole issue got scrapped, and we had to rethink the content strategy around how do you cover this tragedy through the lens of music, and a music magazine that's was currently going under and is still, it's redefined itself from being sort of a business trade publication to something that was more generalist in nature. And we knew that we needed to be one of those voices to tell the story of this Bataclan tragedy. And so that was my first real exposure to how violence can intersect with pop culture, right? And because obviously it's mass shootings and mass tragedies happen at schools, at churches, but in this case it was a music venue. And it was how do we honor the 130 people that were killed that night and the 400 that were injured just enjoying music, the thing that's supposed to uplift us all. And that is sacred ground as well. And so that really started to ignite in me my interest to not necessarily, sure, news journalism as it intersected with music was important to me, but I was less interested in, let's say, covering copyright legislation. I wanted to tell the stories where, hey, there's something wrong in society, or there's something that we need to be addressing, and we can be a voice on how to face it and help people heal by telling the stories of the victims, of how to provide solutions by telling stories on, okay, well, how do you make venues safer in this day and age? What are the barriers to that, and why hasn't it been done? To telling survivor stories. And then when Pulse happened a year later, it was sort of, we had already had the experience with Bataclan, so it was unfortunately something we were sort of familiar with around mobilizing around. But that was also, and I don't know if you all remember, an artist by the name of Christina Grimmie, and she was shot the night before Pulse, also in Orlando, by a stalker / fan. So Bataclan had less to do with our position domestically on gun violence, because that was an international terrorist act. I will say one of the most interesting things that came out of that package was being able to have somebody like James Harkin, who wrote Hunting Season and is an acclaimed ISIS expert, talk about why, the theories around why Bataclan was targeted and Eagles of Death Metal, and the viewpoint of ISIS when it comes to Western music as a reflection of Western decadence, let's say, and the very things that they don't like, right? And so that it was a very targeted, likely a very and they did take claim for it. They claimed it targeted attack on what they thought was, this is a group that burns musical instruments. So in any case, to Pulse and to Christina, we just thought, as the magazine of record for the industry, let's take a stand on this. This is affecting all of us. And so I was very proud to be able to help put together the cover, which was the open letter to Congress, and mobilize 200 artists and industry leaders to sign this petition. And I worked with a friend of mine who's formerly of Teen People. It's funny how The World is So Small, who now runs Everytown, which is a gun safety organization, or she's a director at, and we wrote the letter with their sort of blessing to make sure that you get the language right, because you really have to make sure you get the language right. So if you open that cover, it's the letter, and then it continues with everybody's signature. And then inside, of course, it was a reflection of what happened that night. Again, another article about venues and safety, what you can do in your own communities, how to talk to children. And it was really powerful, and it did, you know, it was presented in front of Congress. Nancy Pelosi sort of took it upon herself. We sent, 463, I can't remember the number, copies to Congress of the letter. And, you know, obviously nothing much has changed, but we took a stand that we felt we were on the right side of history around gun violence and gun control, as it, you know, is just increasingly impacting our sacred spaces and the things that define us as human beings and experiencers of culture. And then Vegas happened, so, and then I quit.
No, that's really interesting because something you just said is that you went to Billboard, you weren't as interested in sort of the policy kind of discussions, but then these human stories become policy questions.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
And so just to transition, I want to give a few minutes for people to ask questions, but tell us about some of your favorite interviews that you've done. You know,
Sure.
You know, just drop some names. I can do the wow us, you know. So.
Well, I mean, Jennifer Lopez, obviously, was sort of as a Latina, was a dream interview for me. She's, I think, obviously a powerhouse, but I also think she hasn't even reached her full potential in terms of empire building, and has an opportunity now with the demographic shifts in the United States to own several lanes in a way that a Latina has not done in the past. So I really enjoyed talking to her and sort of hearing her perspective on all of that. I also, you know, in talking about intersecting news and pop culture, when I interviewed her, it was when all the Me Too stuff started coming out. And, you know, the difference between like sort of a bland cover story or celebrity profile and a really good one is that you get them in part to talk about the topics of the day. And nobody had asked her about her Me Too experiences. So obviously I knew, I mean, that was something that I had to go in and yes, did I have to ask about A-Rod? Yes. But I also really wanted to ask about her Me Too experiences. And she had talked a few years back about a negative experience, but then she really went into depth about it. And sort of her how that had shaped her and sort of how it affected her negatively. So it was good. You know, I like to be able to write stories that have that additional depth. I tried to do the same with Heidi Klum and had no success. Like, she was an expert filibuster. I mean, the celebrity has to be ready to talk about those things. And instead I learned a lot about how she cooks vegetables for her kids for breakfast, which was great too, but I didn't get anything too profound about her Me Too experiences. I mean, I've interviewed Beyonce twice for cover stories, and those are both, one of the things that you realize when you interview a certain caliber of individual who's achieved incredible success is, and this probably goes across sectors, I only know art sector mostly, artist sector, is the dedication, right, and the hard work. And these are people that truly live and breathe their passions and work hard at it and have sort of this constitutional ability, so it seems, to always have a winner's attitude and not let defeat derail them. And they have like fierce competition, like Derek Jeter, I mean, like, just, and A-Rod, like incredible amount of confidence, and willingness to work hard and roll up their sleeves. And that's like, you know, that is something that that's, for the ones that I've interviewed that have had incredible success, that is a common denominator.
Yeah, I found that too. I mean, you know, musicians, they're the ones that are super talented. There's people that work really hard. The people that transcend it are the people that, you know, that for whatever reason that aligns in a certain
Right,
way.
and there's a myopia.
Yeah, right.
And it's just
that's
like,
the
this
focus,
is
right?
all, and there's no noise.
Yeah.
It's interesting and inspiring.
It is very. You know, I know people have read, and then when people need to get to 1 o'clock meetings too. But I want to give a few minutes if y'all have questions or would you like to ask as well?
Future fashion editor right here.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So we didn't talk about like so much of what you do as well, but these I think it's obvious why she was such a great fit for us here at the college. Andrew.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I'm interested in the role as the presidential leader.
Yeah. So
Thank
you put some
you.
scholarship. Yeah.
Thanks.
So,
Thanks for asking.
And it seems like the role as a journalist, to construct a narrative or to extract a narrative, it seems like you're leaning on more like what's out there instead of telling your story and using their stories to propel a narrative. It seems to be like you're really extracting what's there to tell the right story. How do you reconcile that, if it's truly your perspective, with the ideas of leadership and rather than creating like the best path for social change, the fastest path, just reconciling some of those things. Can you tell us a little bit about leadership and your role and how that's coming through?
Oh, that's such a great question. I've never thought about it in that perspective. I mean, I'm not a leader when I'm writing a story, right? So the story leads and the subject leads. So there's no real reconciliation there. I think the presidential leadership program was really specific to this park that I had renamed after my mother in Atlanta after she passed, and it's the first park in the state that's named after a Latino. What I was able to do in a leadership capacity there is smartly tell stories about the park and the genesis of the park and the mythology of the park in a way that propelled the mission of the park forward. So I think in that regard, the leadership and my narrative experience worked really well. You know, I think when it comes to social justice articles and a movement where journalism can play a role, I also think you have to be careful, right? Because, you know, journalism's about presenting the fairest perspective. And I mean, even when we did this one, you know, there was like, well, do we want to take a stand? Because you're not, you know, technically you're not supposed to take a stand. So there were hard conversations, but I think that journalism is changing right now. And I think that the influence of the individual creating, you know, helping to create the stories becomes embedded in a way in those stories, at least in certain outlets where it's allowed. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, it was just basically a springboard to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, and in the spring, we're going to do another one of these and talk more specifically about your community work as a community advocate, especially like you mentioned the wonderful work you're doing around honoring your mother in the park.
Thank you.
But we'll do another sort of talk that we can dig into some of those issues a little bit more today. So, any more questions?
I'm not too familiar with like exactly what you're doing with Rhodes student and the outside of that. So what kind of writing are you doing now that you're in Memphis, like kind of outside of the New York like bubble and that huge like conglomerate of culture? Like have your stories like narrowed down to people specifically here? Are they still as broad?
No, you know, when I came here, I really wanted to be sort of the aggregator of Memphis stories and get those out into the world, but I quickly found, you know, what there, because I do fully believe that like Memphis is extraordinarily reflective of exactly what's happening in this country, right? Like any story, whether it's opioids or incarceration or education, I mean, everything is, like there are prime examples of the conflicts and the complexities here, and I was like, that could be something that I help surface and leverage my contacts in New York and, you know, try to write some great stories, human interest stories and trend pieces. But I got busy because I got the presidential leadership thing simultaneously when I moved here, and the development of my mother's park and the community engagement that required, which was essentially a full-time job. And then I got some really nice plum celebrity assignments that I didn't feel like I could turn down. So I have unfortunately not, and I don't know when I'll be able to help surface those stories that I think that there should be a bureau here for the New York Times. I think that there should be, you know, the editor-in-chief of Time is from Memphis. Like, I think there should be somebody here that covers the Mid-South, you know? I think that those stories need to be told, but unfortunately, I see them constantly, and I'm like, oh, that would be such a good story. And, you know, and it's why I read the Memphis Flyer religiously and the Daily Memphian and the Commercial Appeal to a lesser degree, but, you know, because, like, I think, oh, and there's another one, High News? No, what's the, oh, High Ground News, it's so great. You know, I think that there is an opportunity here to tell those stories broadly that will have national resonance. Unfortunately, I'm not the right person right now to do that and to be that advocate, but maybe. At some point.
And we've been having wonderful conversations in the Curvins with our students about, you know, these sort of narratives. And the thing that's been very helpful is having somebody come into Memphis and see these stories, right? Because when you're here for so long, it's just like, this is just, you know, this is just how this operates. This is how this is. You know, wow, you know. Yeah, Albreen's just down there in his church, but like that's crazy, right? You know, like and there's all kinds of things like that I think is helpful to sort of see from you know, fresh lenses.
Yeah. No, and like I just, oh my God, I've started and stopped a pitch for either GQ or the Wall Street Journal about the reemergence of like music, not reemergence because it never went away, but there's a new energy of music happening with, is it called The Collective and other artists that there's really dope stuff happening. And I think like, God, you're gonna get this on the record, and I feel like this is like, but like, you know, there's an energy here that New York has become too expensive to cultivate, right, artistically, and that's what makes this so special. And I just think like there's an authenticity and a sincerity around creativity and creative expression here that the rest of the world, I mean, I think the Brits already get it, the Japanese already get it. I think like New York sort of needs to rediscover like how friggin' hip Memphis is.
Say your, speaking of on the record, say your line about Memphis. Did you say that?
I was trying to say all that without saying that.
No, I love it.
No, but I mean, Brooklyn is what Memphis, no, Memphis is what Brooklyn wants to be, but it's too pretentious to be.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, but also like too expensive and just like, you know, I mean, there's something really beautiful about what's happening here, and I know it's complicated and there's history that's painful, but it's also rich, and it's what art is born from. Mm-hmm. Like art isn't born on Madison Avenue, and less so on Smith Street in Brooklyn. You know, I mean, art is born in the sort of darker crevices of America. I don't know. So I immediately stepped into Memphis, and I was like, I love this place. I'm so proud to live here. Like, I have incredible cultural pride for this city, and I've barely been here. And I would love to try to help share that story with the world, and I feel bad that I haven't done a better job of it. I just haven't had the bandwidth.
So, yeah. Yeah, so it's sort of at 1 o'clock. So before, I know people have to go to meetings and things, but yeah, y'all join me in thanking Isabel.
Thank you.